you. Thank you. Are we okay? Sound is, you can hear me? Great. I don't think I've seen so many cool glasses in one room before. Okay, so thank you, Erica, for that intro. I am indeed an independent movie producer. So does anyone know what that is? No one really knows what a film producer is, or what we do. So mostly, I do this. I hang out with Ashton Kutcher at Sundance. No, I actually have done this for about 5 seconds in my life, and we took a picture. Most of the time, I'm like this. I'm sitting on a couch, kind of nervous and working hard and stressing out, pulling at my mustache. While creative people are doing something next to me, usually not really paying attention to whatever I'm doing. So I work with creative people. I think what I do myself is creative as well. I like to call myself a creative producer. But I'm really the person that is sort of behind the scenes figuring out how all this is going to work. Someone has a vision, and it's my job to kind of make it happen. So I'm often, looking for good talent, good projects. A good producer is really a good curator as well, which is something I also do at Disposable Film Festival, which I'll talk about soon. But I'm constantly collecting projects. I mean, at the moment, aside from Disposable Film Festival, I have 5 films on my slate at various stages of production. So there's kind of a lot to keep track of. And I like to think that my work really begins with nurturing the initial concept and always, keeping the project's best interest in mind. So that means really listening very carefully to the director, what he or she wants to accomplish, but also to the audience, because ultimately the film is for the audience, not for the director. It begins at the very, very beginning and continues long after everyone else's job is done. Producers these days not only raise funding and sort of oversee the whole project, but then once it's over, they're marketing and dealing with distribution. So it's an involved process. It's not something that's just like, oh, you raise money and then you're done. And then because I think of myself as a creative producer and I'm really try to be involved in every aspect of the work, I really hope that I leave some sort of mark on everything I do. Now, the way I got into producing was unusual. I actually didn't go to school for it in the 50s. But I was in school, I was a grad student, and I was teaching art history. And I really didn't like being in grad school except for the teaching part. And I realized early on that in academia, teaching is sort of like the drudgery you have to do to pay the bills, to do the real work, which is spending time running around the world, doing research and writing books that nobody ever reads. Apologies to anyone who's an academic, but that was my experience. I really, really liked engaging with the students, and I sort of felt like I was in a bit of a crisis because I realized the biggest class I was teaching would be like 300 students, and I did a little math, and I realized that 5 years down the road, if I was lucky, 3 of them would have any recollection of something I taught them. That I was reaching so few people, and even few, like a tiny minority of those I was having any real impact on. So one night I was up late watching PBS, and there was a show on that you might have seen called Spark. It was a show about art in the Bay Area. It still comes on now and then. And it seemed to me that this is like this really, really great way to teach. I mean, I didn't know what the viewership was. It turned out they had a dedicated audience of about 100,000 every week. And it just seemed like, well, if I got involved in this, I could teach some of the core concepts I was teaching in the classroom, and I would reach a whole lot more people that were actually there because they were interested, not just because they were trying to get a degree. Sorry, I've been having sound issues since last night. So I actually volunteered to start working for them, and they couldn't believe like someone who was like a PhD in art history wanted to work, inexperienced and actually not useful I would be. But it was my first taste really of production. I got more and more involved. Eventually they took me on as a contractor. I started helping out, sort of planning the calendar and, sort of brainstorming story ideas, and I really started to see how that was working. And the really exciting thing about that show was they also had this whole online component, which was they would post the stories online and then post also educator guides. And this is like years before YouTube. So it was a way to sort of supplement like California arts curriculum when it was really, funding was being cut like crazy. And it was really sort of like forward-thinking thing. So the day after I defended my dissertation, finished school, and I had to figure out what I was going to do with my life, I met this director who was working on an educational project, and she found out what I was doing with Spark, and she hired me like on the spot to do it. And then one thing led to another, and I ended up producing 3 films with her that ended up going to Sundance and getting involved in all kinds of other stuff as well. At the same time, I realized that even very, very low budget films cost like a fortune to make. Like I'd made this like short with her, and it was like the budget was like $250,000. And I mean, who's got $250,000 to spend on a short? And how are you going to get that money back? And at the same time, I met the person who eventually co-founded Disposable Film Festival with me, and he showed me this camera that had just come on the market. It was $20. You got 20 minutes of footage. It was broadcast quality digital video. And we thought this is really going to change the way people make videos. Everyone now is going to have access to cameras, and we should do something about this. So actually 7 years later, we have the 5th annual Disposable Film Festival, which is on now. When we started it, we had absolutely zero funding. We just had an idea and a lot of enthusiasm and a fair amount of energy. So just to give you a taste, I don't know if you know much about Disposable Film Festival. We show stuff that's just made on really inexpensive and accessible stuff like cell phones, flip video cameras, pocket cameras, things like that. Last night we had the opening night of the 5th annual festival. I brought a film today that we showed last night. It and the filmmakers actually came all the way from Israel, which will be obvious when you see the little title card where they're eating falafel. But here we go. Hopefully this will work. So that was just a charming little film. I love it. It was made on a point-and-shoot camera. Eventually things started to take off, but it was a really, really long road. The first 5 years or so, I guess, that I was working on the film festival, I was working 2 jobs. I would literally, production work is really, really hard and long hours, and I would do like these sometimes more than 10-hour days, and then come home and take a quick break, and then do like 6 to 8 hours in the evening working on the DFF. A year ago, we finally got enough funding that I felt comfortable to quit my job, and then I was going to do DFF full time and just have one job, and that would be great. So that's what I thought I was going to do. It turned out that that wasn't what happened. I actually realized something about myself, which is that I can't really resist a good idea. And so in addition to the Disposable Film Festival, I'm constantly working on film projects. So I'm going to show you a trailer for something that I worked on that premiered at Sundance last year. And then I'll talk a little bit more about that. A good trailer is obviously getting great pull quotes, which, we just made a few calls. And so the director of this film is named Matthew Lessner. I'm actually working with him on a new feature film right now. We're co-writing it, and I'm producing it, and he's directing it. I'm also planning a screening in San Francisco of The Wood, so look out for that. I don't know, find me on YouFace or whatever it is. You'll hear all about it. All right, so what did I learn from my journey from grad school to being a big-time independent film producer? You got to work hard, like really, really hard, and don't expect to get paid or even recognized for a long time. The idea has to be really, really good, but it's not going to happen without hard work also. But eventually it will. So just have faith and keep working at it. Be resourceful. I think over the last 7 years or so, I've asked favors of everybody I know, and they've been very generous. But more important than asking favors is make sure that you're giving people something in return. Be generous with your time and your knowledge and your talents, because if you want people to help you, you got to give something back. Also, run your project like a business. Don't think that you're suddenly going to find a golden ticket in a candy bar. Like that's really, really rare. So always keep your eye on the bottom line. Basically, if it sinks, so do you. So that's the most important thing. That's it. I guess we're on to the questions and answers. If there are questions, I'll try to come up with an answer.
I was there last night, so I was just wondering which film won.
Oh, we announced it actually at the event, so you must have left early. We announced it at the event, so you must have left early, but it was The Nails, the French film.
Oh, Nails!
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, good. I'm glad you liked it. Yeah. Other questions? Jeff?
Are there actual requirements for what you use to shoot film?
Well, actually, that's a good question. When it started out, it was very clear what was sort of a disposable medium and what was, professional one. I mean, at this point, everything is sort of met in the middle. I mean, we include stuff that's shot on DSLRs, and a lot of feature films these days, like low-budget feature films, are shot on DSLRs. So we'd kind of anticipated that was what was going to happen. So the film festival, I think in a way, we've focused more on the aesthetic. It's about, finding a creative way to make a film using what you have available to you. I mean, obviously, if something was shot on a red or something, you wouldn't be able to show it, but it's much more about a certain, spirit of experimentation. We want to see things that wouldn't be seen like in a big theater or at a typical film festival. I mean, there's a film that came out recently called Olive. I don't know how many of you have heard about it, but it was all shot on an iPhone. But it also had a $500,000 budget. So the iPhone is really just a gimmick in that case. We try to look for things that are just really, really inventive and people being resourceful with what they have.
What are you finding that most people are editing the films on? So if they're shooting it on a
Sure.
cheaper camera, but are they editing it really?
Yeah, I mean, editing is, they can use whatever they want. There's, a lot of products that are available that are free or come, or might even be on your phone. Most of the things that we show, I think, are actually cut in Final Cut, just because I think if you know Final Cut, it doesn't take that much to learn it, and it's so much easier to use, ultimately, than iMovie or something like that. Premiere has also been used a lot. Shout out to Adobe.
So what's the lifespan of these movies after they are at your festival?
Oh, it's a great question. So we show them in San Francisco as part of the big weekend that's going on now. And then we have about 25 different international partners. So a sort of variation of the program goes around all over the world. And then we also post them onto our Vimeo channel, and they sort of live online in that way as well.
So you were saying that it's really expensive to make a film, obviously. How do you make a living being an independent filmmaker?
How do I make a living? It's hard.
How does one?
Yeah.
You wanted to make a film that you didn't have.
So, okay, so the kinds of films I make typically start off with a grant. So you have an idea and there are various organizations that will give you grants. San Francisco Film Society is actually an amazing one. If you have a feature project in mind, definitely look into their grants programs. Then once you've sort of developed a screenplay and you have sort of a business plan put together, it's kind of like anything else. You approach investors. And the best way to do that is get to know someone, either meet people with money, or get to know somebody who has access to investors and partner with them. Because you can come in with your sort of project and be a producer on that, and then you can have another producer who comes on as a sort of more executive producer type role, which is generally the person who raises the money or has the contact to the money.
What's a typical grant these days?
I mean, it really depends. It really depends. They range anywhere from micro grants of like about $5,000 to, I think the biggest grant I ever got was probably about $125,000. It also depends on if you're interested in narratives or documentaries. Documentaries in some ways are easier to raise money for because you can approach an organization that has a vested interest in the topic that you're covering. Kickstarter is also a great way to get some money going early on, so you can get work started on it. But again, I mean, the focus, of course, has to be on money. But I mean, at the beginning, you're just going to have to work really hard and maybe not see anything from it. It's just sort of a fact of the business. Over here.
It's sort of related. What is the revenue model for independent film? I'm just not familiar.
That's the really great question. So traditionally there was what we called windowing. So you'd first have like your theatrical release, or I guess, okay, let me back up a second. For independent film, the first thing you do actually is hope to get it into a big film festival. There's one track which is sort of the dream. You get it into like a Sundance or something. One of the distributors is there, sees it at the premiere screening. They fall in love with it. They give you $50 million, and then they go distribute it, and you just sit on a pile of money. So that's something that happens now and then. What's more likely the case, I mean, hundreds of films get into Sundance every year, and a very, very small handful get distribution deals, and often the ones that get distribution deals aren't really making money until years and years later. Most independent filmmakers have to come up with some sort of hybrid model, which is partly working with a big distributor and partly self-distributing. My job a lot of the time these days is helping to market films that I help make. And then the distribution channels are theatrical, which doesn't really bring anything except for press. But that's good because it'll tell your audience about it. And then all those sort of digital channels, everything from VOD to Netflix to places like YouTube Movies that now has like rentals, things like that. All those sort of streams. And then also film producers have to get creative with like their revenue stream. I have a couple ideas that I'm not going to share now, but about major sort of audiences that exist online and how to access them at a very low sort of buy-in. So, kind of sort of almost like what Google does, but for films. Like make it really cheap for them, but then reach like billions of people, if you can. There's another question back there.
How do you build your team from script to distribution?
That's a great question. It's really hard, especially in a place like San Francisco, which doesn't have a big independent film industry. There's a great documentary community here. If you want to do narrative films, though, it's really tough. But thankfully, we also live in a world where there are like Google Docs and Skype, and so you can work with people in New York or Los Angeles. At some point you have to assemble a crew to actually shoot it. There's all kinds of other considerations in terms of like tax incentives to shoot in different states. Right now Louisiana is really hot. No, seriously, it's like everybody's shooting there because it's super cheap. Like the Bay Area is really expensive to shoot in, and so that's a bit of a challenge. Yeah. Yeah. In terms of just like meeting people, you go to film festivals and you meet as many people as you can. You network any way you can, and when you hear about somebody who's good at something, and go do whatever you can to introduce yourself and get to know them. Luckily as a producer, you're the guy who sort of has to come up with the money and hire everybody, so everyone's happy to meet you. Often they have expectations that you may or may not be able to meet, but that makes it a little easier if you're in the producing side of things. Yeah.
What are your favorite and least favorite parts of being a producer?
Honestly, there aren't any least favorite parts. It sounds like the whole thing, sometimes the way I talk about it sounds like drudgery, but I love it. I mean, it's, I think I'd have a much harder time being a director. I like the fact that there's this whole sort of back end that you're working with, and there's like this kind of machinery that you have to work out, and you constantly have to be solving problems. I mean, your main job as a producer is like you have a bunch of problems just dumped on your desk, and you have to figure them all out. And they could be everything from like creative problems, like how is the story going to work in this part? How is this going to make sense to an audience? That kind of thing. To like, oh, we have like no funding at all to do this, and yet we have to do it. So what do we do? Where can we go for funding, or how can we do it for free? Things like that. And I really love all of it. I don't love deadlines, but I think that's just a fact of any job. It doesn't really have to do with producing. Yep.
I'm just wondering, last night you sort of mentioned some of the trends in 2011 with Arab Spring and Occupy. And obviously that's a different movement of things shot on iPhones and on, that type of thing. But, do you see any convergence between sort of aesthetic projects that are increasingly sophisticated and this sort of social movement?
I absolutely think it's going to happen. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the question is that there are a couple of there's this sort of trend going on that I spoke about last night. Is this me? Okay. There's sort of a political movement using mobile video in the Occupy movement or in the Arab Spring, and how that sort of transformed the world. And the question was, do I see a convergence between the sort of more aesthetic use of this kind of media with the more political use? And I think absolutely we're going to see it. I mean, certainly we are seeing it in documentary, but I'm like waiting for the really great narrative feature that will do that. It just seems like it's such like an immediate language, and we understand it so well that it seems like it's gonna happen. There'll be a great film that's made that way. Any other questions? Thank you. You guys are a great audience. I've never seen one. So easy to make laugh.